difficulties from this morning will continue. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you once again to ASEF and specifically to the renewable energy track. So this track is innovations in renewable energy. We have 4 sessions throughout the program. The first one is focused on government policy and regulatory design perspectives from different stakeholders. And I'm really excited about the panel that we have here today. And just to add a little bit more context to what our speakers this morning presented, we have had some really impressive gains in recent years. There have been tremendous falls in prices of renewable energy and tariff prices from competitive auctions. And we've had some really impressive gains in installed renewable capacity. So specifically solar was contributed more than all fossil fuel electricity capacity additions in 2017, and altogether non-hydro renewables accounted for 61% of capacity additions last year. But the job's not done. Last year, these capacity additions are only meeting half of the new demand. And so clearly we still have a lot of work to do. And so not quite time to pop the champagne. It's a little early as well. But I do think that we have some insightful lessons that can help us get there. So earlier this week, I was listening to a podcast where somebody said, we have to design the outcome if we don't want to drift there by default. And I think, the policy and the regulation that governments put in place to create the right environment for renewables to thrive is one of the ways in which we design the outcome. So we're going to hear from a wide range of perspectives this morning. We have very different country perspectives at very different stages of their renewable energy expansion. But first, we're going to start off with Rishabh Shrestha, who's going to give us a high-level look at the policy and regulatory design that's impacted project bankability across the Asia-Pacific region. We'll move then on to Pradeep Pereira, who's going to share with us the challenges that India is facing as they move towards their targeted 175 gigawatts of renewable energy and how they're redesigning the market rules to really make this possible. Jia Yu will share with us how China's energy policy and industrial policy both contributed to massive gains in solar additions in the country and how the subsidy-driven nature of their previous policy now requires a little bit of a relook. Letanthok Lasopo will share with us how Lao PDR is looking to diversify beyond its hydropower resources to incorporate other renewable generation into its power system. I was reminded of Lao PDR this morning during our inspirational talk about Costa Rica. And Raman Chua will give us a private developer's perspective of what's driving energy policy change here in the Philippines and where it ought to be going. So with that, I'm going to kick things off with our first speaker of the morning, Mr. Rishabh Shrestha. He's an analyst for GTM Research, primarily covering global downstream PV markets. Prior to joining GTM in 2018, is that right? Wow. He worked for Make Consulting Research on key global solar markets and solar supply chain. He has experience working in clean tech startups and did his master's in sustainable energy future from Imperial College London. I'm very much looking to his broad overview, regional insights. So please, thank you.
Thank you, Shannon, for the introduction. So I've been looking at global solar markets for about 2 years, and more specifically focused in APAC countries. So today I'll be talking about solar project investment viability in APAC markets. So I'll give our demand outlook and cost trends. We'll talk about challenges and what are the LCOEs. And we'll show what sort of market attractiveness, what are the rankings there, and we'll share some key learnings. So when we talk about project viability, we think about 2 things. Firstly, macroeconomic viability, like landscape, how conducive it is for a sustainable future growth. And secondly, about the financial viability of these projects. And in these both aspects, we see solar as being well suited for growth in this region. we see 67 gigawatts of solar being annually installed in the next 5 years in this region, and we have 2.5% of annual growth in demand in this region. And as you can see in that graph, we see new countries are providing meaningful contribution to annual solar deployment, and this is primarily due to cost reductions that we see. And so over the past 10 years or so, we've seen cost declines from, if you divide the past 10 years into 5 years period, we see a cost decline of average tender bid prices by 40% from around $101 per megawatt hour to around $61 per megawatt hour. These cost declines are pretty unprecedented and are now at our level that are competing against coal and gas LCOE levels, and in some regions going below that. But behind these numbers are also projects that have cost overruns, underperformance of assets, and diminished returns for a variety of reasons. And if we want the industry to progress sustainably, we need to address these concerns. So what are those concerns that we see across the APAC regions? I mean, they're broadly categorized into bankability issues. In China, we have subsidy payment and curtailment risk. And in India, we have potentially trade restriction measures that are increasing costs. In Australia, we have lack of long-term policy certainty, halting development. In Indonesia, we have very aggressive price expectation by the government to match thermal generation plant in a relatively nascent environment. And in Vietnam, we have issues regarding uncertain risk allocation with dispatchability and some dispute resolution risk, threatening bankability. And in Japan, we have very tight timeline expectation on interconnections. So these are all issues that some countries kind of have addressed to a certain degree, and these are things that we can learn from each other and not have to repeat the same mistakes again. And also, in the entire region, I think policy uncertainty is a common thing that could sort of be addressed in a positive way. So what these issues are doing is they're keeping financing costs high, they're eroding expected returns and slowing down development, if not halting them. Another key issue that I want to highlight is the issue with land acquisition and permitting. I think this figure shows the median project size based on our project tracker across APAC, and there are sizable project sizes, and there's various challenges, and there are various solutions such as agro PV, floating PV that we're talking about. But I want to point out to that in India, if you go 5-6 years previously, land acquisition was considered a huge mess. And a lot of developers and investors shied away from investing there. But as we had our session on solar parks yesterday, we see that significant improvements and strides could be made with solar parks, and are also being made in countries such as Cambodia that could really speed up this process of development. And that's a positive development that I see. So moving on to cost. So what are the solar LCOE levels like in the APAC market? They vary significantly from being more than $100 per megawatt hour in countries like Japan to sub $40 per megawatt hour in India. And what I want to show you here is that within each country, the variance of LCOE is pretty high, right? And this is not entirely attributable to the different in solar insolation levels. And so what I think is that there are best practices within each country that you can share so that these LCOE levels variance is more tight and they start to converge within those within the region, and we see that there's room for cost improvements within the country. So when we talk about what are those levers that influences this LCOE, I want to show the sensitivity figure. So here, what it shows is that a change in 1% of the respective variable, what impact does it have in the LCOE? So an increase in 1% of capacity factor would mean that a reduction in 1% of LCOE. So For capacity factor, I'll deal with that in my next slide. But for CapEx, we see a decline of around 15% in the next 5 years on an average. And so this is going towards a good direction. For WACC, weighted average cost of capital, we see that there is issues with bankabilities that are keeping the cost high. But with time, I believe that that's possible. And with proper regulatory framework, we can reduce that. And with the operating cost, I think with proper digital solution, digitizations, there's room for reductions in that as well. So APAC, compared to other European markets, for instance, has a relatively low penetration of solar and wind. So in principle, it should be much easier for us to add that incremental intermittent generation capacity in the grid, right? But but I'd like to highlight that the grid infrastructures are perhaps much weaker. There is differences between the load center and the resources, and these are cause of concerns, and also this also means that the financing costs could be a bit high. And a second thing that I want to point out is that the capacity factors are pretty high in APAC countries, especially because they're closer to equatorial regions. But when we come into sort of actual injection to the grid, that potential might not be realized. And I think there is scope for expanding that potential. And firstly, we've seen that in European markets where when they first started, that the expectation of solar production was a bit lower based on the banking side of view. And as data got shared about what the expectation, the banking requirements and expectation improved. And additional things that could be done is to do with contractual agreement, right? When you have a guaranteed hour or take of pay or with certain proper curtailment mechanism, that further increases investors' confidence and reduces financing costs and delivers project in a much more competitive level. So in this what we did was we took into account various factors such as off-taker risk, off-taker payment support, currency risk, and then we tried to index that for what is the bankability scores for each market, and we compared that with market attractiveness scores. That was also based on various categories that I'll explain later. What we found was that there was no correlation between how attractive the market was compared to the bankability scores. And few things that jumped up was that when there was a low bankability scores, it was the development bank financing was usually high. Development banks were pretty active in that countries, and I think they have quite a good role to play. And secondly, there are projects within the country that have figured out how do we reduce, what are the kind of structures and policy mechanisms that are in place to reduce this cost. And I think that helped. So that's why the correlation didn't exist. But when it comes to long term, we believe that financing, development bank financing would not be available in the long term, and that we do need a proper regulatory framework to bring in the private investors to develop that. And for that, these are the tools, these are the categories that we identify for market attractiveness, and these things need to fall in place if we want a long-term growth. So moving on to what we learned from this study is that the macroeconomic perspectives are quite well in place for solar, and that bankability concerns exist, and they are they're quite different among different countries. And so there's a lot of learning to be done by sharing this technology. And then because of those bankability concerns, the financing costs are high. We're talking about IRR to WACC spreads of more than 200 basis points compared to lower than that in mature markets. And so in short term, although bankability is not correlated, in the long term, that will definitely be correlated. And so we're expecting an LCOE decline of 13% in 5 years. This is by keeping financing costs the same. So if we could reduce those bankability concerns with proper policy framework, we could reduce the LCOE much further. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insights. And I think one of the observations that I saw in the graph was that the variability in cost within India was very different from Indonesia, and that's two countries where I work. And I think Pradeep can highlight in his next presentation a little bit why the conditions in India actually make that the case. So our next speaker is Pradeep Pereira. He's a principal energy specialist in the South Asia department here at ADB, and he is coordinating ADB's energy sector lending operations in India. Dr. Pereira has been with ADB for over 15 years and was involved in ADB's energy sector operations in China, Vietnam, and Laos PDR. During this period, he has structured a number of innovative investment projects in hydropower, renewable energy, energy access, and energy efficiency. He's also conceptualized and led several technical assistance projects, including those to support the establishment of emission trading systems in the People's Republic of China and power market reforms in Vietnam. Prior to joining ADB, he was with the World Bank Group and has worked in both IFC and IBRD. He holds a PhD degree from Imperial College London and a Bachelor of Engineering degree from University of Moratuwa in Sri Lanka. Pradeep, can I please invite you to the stage?
Thank you very much for the introduction. This presentation is based on a series of workshops that ADB, the Niti Aayog, that is the planning body of the Government of India, and the International Energy Agency has conducted in 4 regional cities in India to get an understanding of what are the challenges and what are the kind of policy responses that can address those challenges in achieving this 175 gigawatt renewable energy target that the Government of India has set to achieve by 2022. So for those of you who are not very familiar with the Indian power sector, India has a total power generation capacity of 330,000 megawatts, which consists of around 190,000 megawatts of coal power and about 60,000 megawatts of renewable. That includes about 30,000 megawatts of wind and about 22,000 megawatts of solar. And the solar capacity has been growing very rapidly during last 1 to 2 years. And the coal contributes to about 76% of the generation capacity. Sorry, 57% of the generation capacity, but it provides about 76% of the energy output. Now, renewable contributes about 17% of the installed capacity, but provides, I think, about 9% of the generation as of last year. So you can see that the coal's utilization is much more because the load factor of coal power plants are much higher than the renewables. Basically, if you take the capacity additions, in recent years, the incremental capacity additions of renewables has exceeded that of coal. Last year, as well as going forward, this trend is continue. At the same time, you may have heard about that India suffered from shortages in both power capacity as well as peak capacity as well as energy. Now that has been almostly eliminated as of now. So there are no power shortages in India as of now, other than some localized issues. And this trend again is going to continue, and India will be a power surplus country in the future. It has already achieved that status. Now, this has created certain issues for the thermal power plants. The plant load factor of coal power plant has decreased from 77% in 2010 to about 60% as of 2017. Especially for IPPs, private sector power plant, it has come down to somewhere around 55%. Now, this has created a lot of financial stress in the power sector, especially in the thermal power sector. And some of these thermal power plants are in financial difficulties. This has also translated into a banking crisis. And there are several reasons for this, one being the rapid increase in renewables, but there are other issues like the low offtake by discoms, because the discom sector in India is still suffering from financial problems because there are high ATC losses, high financial losses, and they are not in a position to purchase power. So as a result, they are curtailing power purchase, especially from expensive IPPs. And as a result, there are about 50,000 megawatts of thermal power plant that are under financial stress, both coal and gas. and about 23 gigawatts of coal power plant that are under construction may have similar problems going forward because these plants do not have long-term power purchase agreements, and they also don't have secured, some of them do not have secured access to coal. Because these are the kind of plants that were started when India was suffering from shortages, expecting them to exploit the market prices. But now the market prices have come down due to the surplus generation. As a result, this kind of coal power plant that are under construction and also merchant power plant will find it difficult to service their financial obligations. So this has become a major issue in the financial sector. So there's about $60 billion worth of loans given to this coal power plant are now under various stages of rescheduling. So the solar prices have come down rapidly, as mentioned by the earlier speaker, and India has probably the lowest solar prices. It has reached the grid parity. It has crossed the average coal power tariff of NTPC. And India has set this target of 175 gigawatt by 2022, and it's very well on its course to achieve that. It has already achieved 60,000 gigawatts. And as you can see, there's going to be hardly any increase in the coal capacity going forward from 2022 and to 2027. If you cannot, the last bar chart is for 2027, and the middle one is for 2022. But there are issues in integrating this kind of large amount of renewables into the system. I'll come back to that in my next slide. We have done a little bit of a detailed analysis of the southern region of India. Here, the renewable penetration is even higher. It has already reached about 14% in terms of energy and 28% in terms of capacity. It will reach 41% in terms of capacity and 24% by generation by 2022. Now, this India has also taken several policy initiatives to achieve this 175 gigawatt target. They set up a dedicated Ministry for New and Renewable Energy, to spearhead these efforts. There's a dedicated financial institution, India Renewable Energy Finance, IREDA. ADB has a loan with IREDA. And then they set this target, so to give certainty and direction to the private sector players to invest in renewable sector. And they have set up renewable portfolio standards for DISCOMs and for large consumers. And they started with kind of 11%, 11.5% now. It will be increased to 17% by 2019, and it will go further up. And there's a separate carve-out for solar, and there's a dedicated transmission infrastructure. Some of this dedicated transmission infrastructure is financed under ADB, by ADB under the Green Corridor initiatives. And the renewable energy plants are exempted from interstate transmission tariff. India has separate transmission tariff, and if a renewable plant in Tamil Nadu wants to sell it to, let's say, in northern India, they're exempted from this transmission tariff. And India is aggressively adapting the reverse auction approach to get the renewable capacity contracted. That is where the winning or the lowest bidder has to the other bidders, the losing bidders, can match the price offered by the lowest bidder, and this can go on until everybody sort of come to a market clearance price. And this has achieved very, very low prices, especially for solar. The recent auction was awarded around ₹2.50, which is about 4 US cents for solar, and wind has been awarded around ₹3.50, which is something around little over 5 US cents. And they are setting up dedicated renewable energy parks of gigawatt scale, 1,000 plus megawatt scale. The land acquisition, the previous speaker mentioned about the issues with land acquisition. This has now been taken care of by the government. Government has set up these large solar parks with land provided for, all the infrastructure, including transmission, provided for, and also most of the risks that are relevant to the solar sector has already been taken care of. So this is more like a plug and play kind of approach, where the investors can come and plug in their plant. And that has enabled them to achieve these kind of very good prices. And then they are also providing accelerated depreciation, so that also provides another incentive for the investors. And the renewable energy also has must-run kind of a preferred dispatch arrangement. And India is setting up 7 sophisticated renewable energy management centers in renewable-rich states like Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and few other states, where these REMCs will have very sophisticated pneumatic weather forecasting-based renewable forecasting capability. They would also have full visibility to the renewable generators. They can even control the renewable plants from the REMC. So this would enable the further integration of renewable in the future. But there are issues, I mean, especially in states like Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, I think, which has high renewable penetration, has curtailment issues. Some of the transmission lines that are evacuating renewable power do not meet the N-1 criteria. So in the case of a transmission emergency, sometimes these renewable plants might have to be curtailed. Some of the older renewable energy plants that were commissioned about 5 to 6 years ago doesn't have the low voltage ride-through facility. There's a slight, I think, typing mistake, which I could not correct. And also some of the older renewable plants which were contracted maybe 5, 6 years ago has higher tariffs. And now I think there is a sort of measures, I think at least some DISCOMs are trying to renegotiate this, but the government is not really encouraging that, because that would send their own wrong signals to the market. But the other issue is the impact of this high renewables on the thermal power sector. Now, thermal power plants has to back down to accommodate renewable energy, especially during high wind and high solar seasons. And that has created a cost increase in terms of the operating cost of thermal power plants. Their ramp in frequency has been increased, and that need to be compensated for, because you can't have renewables without thermals. I mean, I don't think you can have 100% renewable system in the current context. So when you have more and more renewable, there's a cost to the thermal sector, and that need to be taken into account, and that's a regulatory issue that the regulators will have to look into. I think India is keenly looking into that, and they have already come up with certain mechanisms to reward the thermal power plants for providing this additional flexibility that is required for accommodating thermal renewables. And now this also, they are also taking measures to expand the scheduling area or the balancing area. I think yesterday in the workshop that we had done this same topic, this was one of the recommendations from NREL that is being sort of adapted. And also the scheduling and dispatch interval of thermal power plant is being reduced to 5 minutes from 15 minutes. That was again a recommendation from NREL. And the minimum loading of thermal power plants has now been reduced to 55% from 70%, again another NREL recommendation. And now I think they're thinking of, they're preparing, or they're at least open to set up a capacity market and an ancillary services market to reward the thermal power plants for providing this reserve capacity, frequency reserve capability. So these are some of the regulatory and policy measures that need to be taken into account if they are to achieve these renewable integration targets. So I'm running short of time. I would stop here. But they are also taking measures to have a storage, long-term storage, especially in the form of hydropower, pump storage hydropower. And they have to set up a transparent mechanism to procure the flexible generation reserves. I mean, basically from the thermal power plant. At the moment, the Indian power market do not have that capability. But these are the kind of measures that Niti Aayog and ADB and IEA might continue to support as a follow-up to this series of workshops that we have conducted. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Pradeep. So just as a housekeeping measure, all the presentations are going to be uploaded. Is that correct? Okay, because I see some people taking pictures of the slides, so you'll get better copies to download in the near future. So just a quick reflection. I mean, I think India clearly has really pioneered some of the initiatives that other countries are now adopting, like solar parks and reverse auctions, and that really has done a lot to bring down the cost. In terms of the impacts on thermal generation, I know that some of those problems were already existing before the renewable generation really started to grow. So I'd question how much of it is actually attributable to renewables versus some of the other challenges in the sector, like the coal production and the financial health of the distribution utilities. But an important question to ask for sure. So to follow that, I think we have another really leading example that really can provide a lot of insight for other countries that are, I guess, not as far along on their renewable energy expansion path. And to lead us through that discussion, we have Dr. Jia Yu. She is a senior operations officer and the director of international development cooperation at the Institute of New Structural Economics at Peking University. And she is responsible for the application of new structural economics to the international investment practice. I noticed she's also on the steering committee for the New Energy Leaders, so thank you for your participation in that program. Previously, Dr. Yu worked for more than 8 years for the State Power Investment Corporation, International Minerals and Investment Corporation Limited, as the director of the Department of Business Development and Public Relations. She was responsible for overseas energy and mining investment and public relations at corporate level, global research, resources market research, China's outward foreign direct investment policy, and empirical studies at a macro level. We're very pleased to have you and like to invite you to come and give your presentation.
Thanks, Madam Chair. It is my great honor to speak in this session. I know that the topic is about the government policy and regulatory design for renewable energy. And as I received the invitation yesterday to speak, so I was able to quickly put together some slides to show China's policies and experience in the solar PV industry sector. So here is an outline for the 10 minutes. First, I will be glad to show the success of China's solar PV development. And following by that, actually there are two successful factors behind China's success: the energy policy and the industrial policy. And the third part is about the issues of sustainability, the feed-in tariff versus the auction, and finally the takeaways. Here we go. And just 2 days ago, a report by REN 2021 has been released here. So according to the report, the top 5 countries in 2017, and we can see that China's leading in hydro, in wind, in other clean energy. And here today, I will focus on the solar PV sector. And here, in terms of the annual additions and the previous year's capacity, we can see that China is always takes the first place. And the cumulative PV installation last year is about more than 130 gigawatt. So it surpassed 30% of the world total. And in terms of the annual, the newly addition of China's the PV installation, it is almost more than half of the world global. So it is. All these numbers are very impressive. So China, it's true that China is successful for the PV, the solar PV industry. So the successful factor behind this is there are 2 pillars. One is the energy policy, and the other is the industrial policy. I will explain now. Regarding to the energy policy, because we have a very big concerns and the Chinese people suffered from smog during the last 10 years, so we have a strong need to improve the air quality in Chinese cities. And at the same time, the determination in pursuing the low-carbon energy transition as part of China's commitment under Paris Agreement. So here, the table just shows we have very high incentives to encourage the solar PV with generous feed-in tariff, and all these tariffs are decided in terms of the different regions with different natural endowment, and it's about 8 to 10 US cents for utility scale PVs and 5 cents for distributed solar PVs. It is about the energy policy, and we have also a very strong impact of industrial policy. Here, I just want to share a little of the background. During the past 5 to 10 years, and due to the rising labor cost, salaries for the labor-intensive manufacturing sector in China, actually, many Chinese investors in manufacturing sector, they want to move their factories from China to some countries or regions with lower labor cost. So, and according to the Chinese statistics, there is 85 million jobs, direct jobs in labor-intensive manufacturing sector. So you can see if 10%, we can just imagine if 10% of these 85 million jobs move from China to other countries, such as the South Asia countries or African countries, then how keep the labor, the employment in China? So that's why the government has a series of industrial policy. So here is the statistic about the Chinese manufacturer. We can see that from these two tables, and the Chinese manufacturers dominate the solar PV in the world. And last year, the global PV shipments were approximately 92 gigawatts, with China supplying around 57%. So, and for both domestic consumption market plus the international market. And this table is more impressive. We can see that the job creations in solar PV, we have more than 2.2 million jobs, and 66% of the total solar PV jobs in the world. And for China, so that's why regarding the background of the manufacturing sector development in China, so the PV sector, the Chinese government has very strong incentive to encourage the development of the PV sector, the solar PV sector. That's why it is a success. Okay, so here is the pillars behind the China's PV development. And now the key issue of sustainability is the feed-in tariff and funded by the renewable energy surcharges. And here are some numbers. The feed-in tariff in China are funded by the renewable energy surcharge around the 0.3 US cents per kilowatt hour, and the charge on the industrial plus commercial customers. And the renewable energy surcharge has been increasing, now to the 0.019 kilowatt, but not enough to provide the needed subsidies. For example, in Germany, the renewable energy surcharge is about the 0.3 kilowatt hour. It's 10 times higher than China. So, and now the arrears in dispersing the subsidies currently amount to about RMB 100 billion, equal to the 16 billion US dollar, affecting most of the utility scale solar PV projects. So we can see that in fact, the surcharge collection cannot cover the strong growth of subsidy demand. And the recent regulation to put cap on the solar PV projects and further reduce the feed-in tariff. So according to some experts in that sector, the China's solar PV installation in 2018 may drop by a third. Yeah. So yeah, here maybe we have another choice. So for example, like India, the auction, the method of auction is applied very successfully, and so maybe and they can. By the competition, so the cost and the price is in a very competitive level, and so according to our proposal, maybe we can encourage the solar plus model. That means the solar plus farming, or the solar plus fishing, or solar plus sheep raising, etc., and can provide viable business models for expanded solar PV markets in China and reduce the dependence on subsidies. So it's also maybe a good way to help the solar to expand the market. Okay, so finally, the takeaways. First, the solar PV development has been largely driven by the energy policy, such as low carbon transition and clean air in China. And secondly, in China, the solar PV development is also part of industrial policy, so that's the creation of jobs, etc. And the feed-in tariff mechanism is very effective to start a market. However, it is not sustainable. And the solar PV auctions can lead to more sustainable renewable energy development. And most important factor, stable, transparent, and predictable policy and regulatory framework, so developers can assess the risks and make their investment decisions and can proactively make their decisions. It is very important. And finally, maybe a solar plus can offer viable business models to reduce the dependence on subsidies. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
So a lot of lessons there, I think, for many countries that are looking at renewable energy more intensely now. And I think that the air quality issue is not unique to China, and that could certainly affect choices with respect to backing down coal generating units and increasing renewable energy. Also interesting to me is that the industrial policy piece of it is something that we've heard the flip side of in other countries where they're highly productive agricultural land. They're not favoring converting that for power production. And so the solar plus model that you discussed is something that's in high demand by many countries. So moving on to Laos PDR now. This is a country at a very different stage of solar and wind development, but with a lot of hydropower already. And we have Mr. Latanolok Lasopo, who leads the Energy Policy Division within the Department of Energy Policy and Planning at the Laos PDR Ministry of Energy and Mines. Mr. Latanolok is an expert in power sector planning, policy making, statistics management, and has supported these activities for over 18 years at the ministry. He also has a lot of experience cooperating with international partners, including the United States Agency for International Development, the World Bank, JICA, and ADB. He holds a Bachelor of Engineering degree from the University of Laos and a Master of Engineering degree from the University of Technology in Bangkok. Please, may I invite you?
Thank you very much, Shannon, for the introduction of my personal background and my experience. Well, as Shannon mentioned, I am Latanolok Lasopo. I'm from the Department of Energy Policy and Planning, and I'm in charge for the energy policy. Today, I would like to share with you about the work we done with the NREL, National Laboratory Energy of the U.S., under the support from the United States, the Agency for International Development. My topic is related to about the potential on the alternative renewable energy, especially for non-hydro. As you may know, the government of Laos, we has historically prioritized the investment on hydropower resources to ensure the secure, reliable, and affordable of supply. The country has great benefit from the development of hydropower, especially power sector. This is the share of our resources. You may see that the hydro is the more share of our electricity production. This photo just shows the first big hydropower in Laos. In the year 2017, we have the total capacity of about 60,000 megawatt plus. This is the last updated. Now we move to the work task we do with this program. Just to introduce you as the other country, the overall strategy for us of the power sector, the policy objective is to increase energy security, increase power system reliability, increase sustainability, which is including environment, technical, economic, social aspect, everything. And of course, reduce the environmental impact. Of course, one more important thing is about affordability of the electricity price. And also, because we are located in the Southeast Asia and bordered by so many countries, so inter-power connections also very important. So now this is the task that we work with the NREL. And today I will focus on task 2. There are 5 tasks. There are 5 of them. And today I focus on task 2 about the assessment of the potential on renewable resource, but focus on non-hydro. The Lao technical team, we call it technical committee, conduct a geographic information system to analyze the domestic resources. This assessment considers the generation system performance, topographic limitations such as slope, environmental land use, constraints such as protected area. So our analysis, we use the spatial data to analyze potential on our renewable energy. The GIS-based analysis requires significant set of spatial data. So, but this is no-cost web-based platform. And the technical team, we use the Explorer platform. You may see this is our website. You can access to this website to see what we have analyzed in our GIS data. And by using, as I mentioned in the previous one, by using the constraint of the land use or the protected area, we have analyzed on the left-hand side, this is for wind, and for the right-hand side is for solar. So if you see in the each scenario, which is consider every constraint in here, but it's not so clear here, sorry. Each scenario indicates the resource, the potential for us. This is the output that we after we mention the all the constraint. So if you see in overall everything put in the model, in this model, you can see that there are larger area for the potential for wind. But if we limit the protected area, the land, the wetland, the other land use area, so we can narrow down the potential. And this is scenario 4 that I mentioned in the previous slide, that when we narrow down everything, the potentials for suitable area in the wind is about 95,000 square kilometers with the capacity, with the available capacity of 179 gigawatt, with the production of about 200 gigawatt hours. And this is same as the wind power, but this is for solar. The same, we will narrow down the protected area, wetland, and the land use. And this is the demand and supply for our country from 1991 to the year 2055. So when we look at the demand projection, which will jump from 22,000 terawatt to 33 terawatt hours per year. So this is the potential. On the right-hand side is the potential from other non-renewable, non-hydro resources for the country, based on the projection of GIS-based data. So this is looking forward for the work with the U.S. Clean Power Asia about the resilient power system planning. So the technical potential result present the opportunity for us to diversify. As I mentioned earlier, we expect to diversify the power generation, because in the previous we are based on hydro. So now the diversify and mixing of the power generation very important for us to secure more the power supply. So we also working with the Clean Power Asia to address the issue here, the potential vulnerability of the power supply, and appropriate method to assess the vulnerability, and the option that improve our power sector resilience. So this is the work would be continue with the U.S. Clean Power Asia. And thank you very much.
Thank you for that presentation. So again, sort of at a much earlier stage of thinking at their solar and wind development, but using these GIS-based tools can be a really powerful way to quantify what a huge resource actually exists, even when you limit it and restrict it to areas that are really viable to get these big, wind blades into. So thank you very much for that presentation. Next up, we have a private developer perspective, which I'm really excited to hear about. We have Raman Chua. He's the vice president of First Gen Corporation, and he leads the business development projects for solar and wind, the most notable of which is the 150 megawatt Burgos wind project in the Philippines. He began his career with the Lopez Group, working on business development under FGP Corporation, and he was studying natural gas power vehicles as an extension business, and he was then also looking at Manila North Tollways Corporation as a manager for marketing, compliance, and business development, during which the rehabilitation and expansion of the North Luzon Expressway was undertaken and successfully completed in 2001. 2005, to the great joy of many people who drive that road. So anyway, with no further ado, I would like to invite Rahman to share his thoughts with us.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you very much. Good morning good morning to everyone. The Philippines is at the cusp of a revolution that is sweeping the world today, with many powerful vectors converging to transform the energy industry as we know it. If we're able to seize them and ride the wave, we have a golden opportunity to leapfrog and build a power industry that's truly for the 21st century. A power industry that does not only address inclusive economic development, but adopt exponential technological advances and mitigate climate change as well. You know, as I was preparing for this speech today, I came across a news article published by CNN, which quoted the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's monthly global climate report of April. And it noted that for 400 consecutive months, or for more than 33 years, the Earth's temperature has been above average. And April 2018 is the third highest temperature of any April. And then 18 of the warmest 19 years have occurred since 2000. Now, while natural factors can account for some of these anomalies, the NOAA scientists say that the overall pattern is definitely not natural. And these are mainly due to human-caused warming. And the NOAA scientists further predicted that while climate change is real, and I can't imagine how anyone can still deny it at this point, we will continue to see global temperatures increase in the future. The Philippines enjoys an unenviable reputation of ranking among the top 5 most vulnerable and the #1 country in the world affected by climate-related disasters, according to the Global Climate Risk Index. For us living here in the Philippines, this is not surprising. Over 50% of the Philippine municipalities are located along coastal regions. Almost all major cities are coastal. The only major city I can imagine that's not coastal probably is Baguio City in the mountain province. And 62% of Filipinos live in coastal zones. While this is already disturbing, what I find most disturbing is how climate change reportedly affects children the most. According to a paper published in the journal Pediatrics, children are estimated to bear 88% of the burden of diseases related to climate change. Extreme heat waves have caused emerging infectious pathogens, such as the Zika virus, an increased incidence of waterborne bacterial infections. Extremely high seasonal temperatures and extreme weather events could damage crops, impacting the food supply and thus childhood nutrition. It is in this backdrop that the clean energy revolution is underway in the Philippines. While the rest of the world is moving toward clean energy, the Philippines is a different story. Here at home, coal plants continue to be built unabated. Coal accounts for 50% of our country's power generation, produced by 21 existing coal plants. 27 more are planned to be built in the coming years. In 2016, as a company, we declared unconditionally that we would not do coal-fired power plants anymore. We are the first and so far the only major conglomerate to do so. It wasn't always that way. We were actively bidding for power plants which included coal during the Philippine government's privatization program over 15 years ago. However, that view changed immensely in November 2013, when climate change became very real for us. And that was when our largest geothermal plant in Leyte, southern Philippines, was directly hit by one of the most powerful typhoons on historical record to ever hit the planet, Typhoon Haiyan. Personally fearing for the lives and safety of all our 743 employees and their families, and seeing them knocked off their feet overnight had an enormous impact on how we've moved forward as a company. As an energy company, it was obviously no longer a business as usual scenario for us. And that is why we decided to go on this purely RE platform. And that platform, we face quite a number of challenges. Price competition is intense, and retail competition and open access is underway. Low price is still the main driver of electricity consumers. This has driven down profit margins of all power producers in the Philippines, coal or renewable energy developers. Another challenge is the short perspective of a government ambivalent about climate change issues. Despite our countrymen's vulnerability to the effects of global warming, only token importance is given to such concerns in national public policy. Priority is power adequacy and cheap electricity prices. The recent coal tax was a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. It will only amount to as little as 1 to 3 centavos per kilowatt hour in tariffs to coal-fired power plants. In other countries like India, the coal tax is 6 centavos per kilowatt hour. In South Korea, it reaches 25 centavos per kilowatt hour. Coal-fired power plants being the easiest to develop and its fuel supply the simplest to procure, every competitor and new entrant is seeking to build more coal-fired power plants in a vicious race to the bottom. You might wonder what keeps us committed to this green road despite all the obstacles. There are more and more companies that are conscious about greening their footprints and supply chains. This has a lot to do with the millennial consumer coming of age. In the Philippines, we've been seeing more electricity customers specifically coming to us because they want to green their supply chains with renewable power. Then there is the RE100, 125 of the world's largest companies pledging their individual glide paths towards using 100% renewable energy in their supply chains. In our country, in the Philippines, 4 provinces have stepped up to reduce carbon emissions, declaring themselves as coal-free now and forever. Another reason we're so committed to a green platform is they happen to be very competitive in the Philippine market, despite what you read in the media today. The Philippines is primarily a services-driven economy. Retail competition and open access that's underway and progressing will disaggregate that demand. The Green Energy Options Program will give retail customers up to the household level the choice to source their power from renewable sources. Another reason for optimism about clean energy is that the forces of technology moving very fast. Solar, wind, and battery storage have experienced exponential cost reductions over the last few years, and we hope to ride that wave as a company. But the energy revolution in the Philippines will happen. That is a given. If I may quote John F. Kennedy, he once said that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. To my mind, I believe that the path towards a peaceful revolution is one paved with choices. All consumers should have a choice. Choice should be real. It should be a well-informed choice. And choice only matters if one is free to make it. After almost 2 decades of delay, their full retail open access should not be delayed any further. The RE law was approved last 2008, and today, we still do not yet implement the Green Energy Option Program. It is still in its draft form. With coal remaining to be the centerpiece of an energy policy there appears to be a wholesale denial of the reality of climate change and the havoc it will wreak on our fellow Filipinos. Whatever the case is for this denial, it is up to advocates like us here today and informed consumers out there to be vigilant, to act, and to help government regulators make the right choices. Choices which we consumers will end up paying for whatever happens. We no longer have the luxury of time to make this choice. The revolution is coming. In fact, it might already be here. Thank you very much and good morning.
Thank you, Raman. I think it's really inspiring to see what a bold business decision that First Gen made with respect to going zero coal. And I think, unfortunately, the trend that you mentioned with many coal plants being unabated, being built unabated, is not just it's something that's of concern in the Philippines, but throughout Asia-Pacific countries. So we now come to the part of our morning where we get to ask some questions of the panelists. And I think because things ran a bit long this morning, we've got a short amount of time, but I want to make the most of it. If there are burning questions already, I would invite people to raise your hand and we can get a mic to you, please. And while he's getting a mic, I think I'd also like to just sort of say, you know, this last presentation, you made a comment about the price competition being really intense. Rishab made a comment at the beginning about cost overruns and underperforming assets, and yet we've got this environment where we're all going towards more and more competitive auctions. And so I think that there's a big question about, you know, how do we keep driving down the costs while making sure that we retain an attractive entry point for developers. So I don't know if anybody on the panel would like to comment on that while we're waiting for a microphone to get to our first question.
Hello. Yeah, I think what you described there about uncertainty environment with hyper-competitive auctions pushing down prices, as well as the need for cost reductions to be there is a very big pressure on the renewables in the renewable industry. In some ways, I feel that when you have like some other mature markets, when you have a scheduled kind of auctions that gives you a pilot saying, okay, that gives the various stakeholders to optimize. Perhaps they don't win as much share in this particular auctions. They can do so in the future. So I think that's one way that could bring that improvement if you have a scheduled auction. And secondly, I think there is this idea of having a minimum size. I think India has introduced this in some auctions where there's a minimum size and a maximum size where certain companies could win. There is both advantages and disadvantages to that. And I think that's another possibility. And lastly, I'd also want to say that there are programs where we've seen, again, in mature markets where they incentivize community ownership model. So in auctions, and these kind of ease the land acquisition kind of process. And also when you slightly incentivize that more, it levels the playing field for various players. And these are just some of the approaches that I think could help the industry move forward.
I think basically there are two ways of procuring renewable. One is the feed-in tariff as PRC, the China has adapted, and the other one is more competitive auction-based method. So there are pros and cons of both. I think the feed-in tariff, I think, provides the price certainty to the bidders, and it's much more simpler to administer. But then the issue is the sustainability of feed-in tariff regime-based renewables. I think Germany has faced that issue. Some European countries now, I think China is also facing that issue. So you have to, at one point, I think, you have to transition from feed-in tariff to auction-based system. The auction-based system, sometimes the private sector bidders might come with sort of unrealistic prices, and they might struggle to deliver what they have bidded for. That's something I think countries like India will have to take note of, because now the prices have come to a level which sort of defies belief, I think, because it's so low at the moment. And it's questionable whether we can deliver at those kind of prices.
Yeah, I think we're all watching with interest to see if some of these projects, if all of these projects will actually materialize. I certainly hope so, but we want the companies to be successful and build other projects in the future as well. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Mustafa Sadat, the project development consultant with ADB in Afghanistan. My question is from the panel that we have been struggling with setting up the targets for our policies. What are some of the tools that are used in your countries or in your region of influence to set up the most realistic targets in the policies? Like, what are some of the tools that one can use or a country can use to achieve realistic targets for renewables and also energy efficiency? Thank you.
Yeah, I think for this question, maybe take China as an example. For the government, in fact, there is a trade-off between the subsidy in renewable energy sector and the surcharge for the industrial and the commercial sectors. So usually the government may want to balance between these two sides, and also my personal understanding is for a policy maker, it is very important to make your policy as transparent as possible and to give a very clear timeline so that the investors will have a very will proactively take their decisions in terms of the production plan as well as the investment plan. If a sudden policy or a surprise policy can be harmful for the producers and investors.
We have another question up here in the front. So that's a really interesting point, that it's not just the technical and economic potential that Lao is looking at, but also if you're going to have to subsidize, how much of the government budget can you allocate for that purpose? Yeah, please.
Just adding a quick note onto that, we've seen that certain places where our renewable energy target has worked clearly, such as in US, Australia, but not as much somewhere else. And I think it's important to think whether you want to prioritize a renewable energy target or clean emissions target, which could have different implications. And second thing to consider is, as a government, do you want to pick winners in terms of technology? Certain countries have solar carve-outs or wind carve-outs, or do you want to have, say, distributed generation targets versus large-scale renewables targets? And I think these are something to think about. And secondly, there are also ideas about having a flexible target based on, baseline of 2000 levels. Let's reduce emissions by this much compared to a hard target of achieving that. So there are lots of tools, and some are successful, some are not, depending on the situations, that I'd be happy to talk about in later.
And just to add to what has been said already, just in terms of policy, I think more than the tools to draft the policy, I think we shouldn't forget that when we set installation targets, for example, in a particular country, that it's not as simple as saying we need to build, X number of megawatts by a certain year on a national level, because but we also need to consider where to put it and what those capacities will mean in terms of how it will impact a particular part of the grid or system where it will connect. And this is a very real problem in the Philippines right now. When we set a 500 megawatt installation target for solar in 2015, and there was over almost a gigawatt of capacity that was built, and it was concentrated in this one tiny island in the Visayas called Negros. And with so much capacity, the island only had a peak demand of about 190 megawatts, but almost 300 megawatts of solar farm was built on that island, right? So, and you know, that's you know, it's good that it was built, but it's wasteful because then you can't really benefit from the solar generation because the system is constrained in that area. So that's, I guess that's the fine print in the policy that we need to pay attention to.
Good morning. I'm Mr. Dungay of Green Energy Development Corporation. I have one question to GIO and one response to Roman Chua. First to GIO. You mentioned earlier that there is now a tremendous pressure on the cost of labor, especially in the solar production. And you are seeking for possible ways that if this could be transferred to other countries, then I think we should be a recipient for that now because it will generate employment on our part. So maybe we can discuss more about that after this. But we would like to know what other conditions that you would require to consider that particular other ASEAN countries to be the new location of the plant. Maybe you may not be able to get all the information about that, but we would like to hear something about rough condition that you would like to place that in other countries.
Do you want to quickly make your comment to Ramon as well so we can give the opportunity for another person to take the mic? Just
Yeah, okay.
quickly before she answers.
For the other concern as to the unabated construction of coal plant in the Philippines, we are on the same footing, and I agree with you, because in Mindanao particularly, 90% of the new plant are coal plant. So that is actually very alarming. However, if we are going to look into the point or position of the national government, there is no other sources of power that can immediately be developed to meet the growing demand, especially with the build infrastructure that is actually undertaken by the national government. We need a large chunk of power in a very short period. But I agree with you that we need to put a stop on this. We have to find ways later on. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question, and also thanks for giving me this opportunity to clarify my ideas. For many developing countries, actually the jobs and exports are the two priorities. And there is the 85 million job in labor-intensive sector in China are looking for somewhere to relocate. Yeah, that's true, but the sector is not for all the manufacturing sector. Yeah, so it's more about the garment, textile, and for example, from the year 1990s to 2013, for the T-shirt export, China is always the top one, but after 2013, Bangladesh now replaced China to be the top one for the T-shirt export. So for those sectors, yeah, that's true. There is a strong trend of relocation from China to other lower labor cost countries or regions. But for the other sectors, such as solar PV, because they need a very long production line and upstream and downstream together, so we cannot move all to other countries. And also now in China, we are facing economic problems, saying the overcapacity for some sectors. So we considering the solar PV sector can create many jobs, and also we will also we need the industrial upgrading. So that means the garment, the textile, or other light manufacturing will move to other countries. But the solar PV, currently, it is a very good sector to create jobs. So that's why the Chinese government has a strong incentive to encourage the development of this sector. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? Yeah, please. Can we get the mic down there? There's a gentleman down there who has a question. Interesting, and also thinking of Lao as well, in terms of exports, you're not exporting the panels, but you're exporting the power. I mean, you're looking to expand your generation from solar and wind. And do you have any comment on that as like an industrial policy that you want to grow your power exports even more?
Thank you. As you may know, we have a lot of hydropower, and the network, the electricity network for the neighboring countries is increased, especially with Thailand. So in terms of more reliability of the system, we need to strengthen the transmission line system, not only for export, but for the power exchange of the region, especially for the GMS. So this is one of the strategy and policy that the government need to raise up on this term of export.
Thank you. All right, I think I'll make this our last question of the session. I hear people buzzing in the hall, which probably means food is available.
Thank you. My question relates to policy and its sustainability. The problem in the Philippines is we have single 6-year terms of government. There are constraints at the end of a lifetime of a government, 6 months before you can't finish a project, 6 months into the next term, you can't start one. So you have 5 years of effective project implementation. But when the government changes, so do most of the civil service and the management of the country, something which Mr. Chua is more than well aware of, I'm sure. The other panelists probably enjoy much more continuous repeat policymakers and repeat governments. What advice would they have for the Philippines to see if projects can actually be sustained longer than a single term?
Does anyone want to take that? I will just mention that yesterday I was in a policy where we had a former finance, somebody who worked for the finance ministry in Mongolia, and she said that the government changed every 2 to 3 years. So 6 years to her probably seems really long. But does anyone on the panel? Yeah, Pradeep?
I think the issue is, I think earlier question also about the targets. I think there has to be some continuity, I think, in the policy. The individuals can change, I think that you cannot avoid. But the overall policy, I think, has to remain the same. Like, for instance, if you set a target that goes beyond the term of a particular government, I think that need to continue. You can always update these targets as things, the technologies evolve. I think, for instance, nobody expected solar to achieve the price tariff compatibility with parity with coal a few years ago. But now I think solar has achieved that, so you can have more ambitious target for solar. But I think the important thing is that you set the target and set a realistic target and take effective measures to achieve that target. I think China, I think, has a lot of experience, I think, in setting targets at realistic and ambitious levels and always achieving those targets. I think, whereas now India is also, I think, moving in the same direction. And setting up target is not sufficient. I think you have to have the enabling environment to achieve that target. That's where the policy is important. And I mean, your question, I think, is valid, but you have to maintain policy continuity in spite of government changes.
I think that's a very good question for the entire region. Policy uncertainty is a very common challenges that we see. And I think from a policy perspective, it's as a renewable start, I think it's important for policy to guide them to that mature state. But I think it's also important policy not to interfere and have that level playing field with all kind of generations. And once that happens, then it's the economics that determines the long-term sustainability. And so that could be solar plus storage should be competing with as a firm power contract requirements and so on. And I think so maybe limiting policy in certain cases could also be an answer for a future policy for future sustainable growth.
I guess maybe just to close on that, there's also the public opinion piece, and I think Monica Aria hinted to that. Well, not hinted, she explicitly said how important it was for getting people bought into the Costa Rica Limpia program, and she really emphasized that earlier on because it's the people who vote. And so if the public opinion is behind these shifts, then the government won't do away with them just because the people in charge change. So I would like to thank you all for spending an hour and a half with us this morning. I would very much like to thank our panelists for sharing their insights with us, and would you please join me in thanking them with some applause.